The magazine was funded by David Pecker, who ultimately is a character later on in politics when he catches and kills stories for Donald Trump in 2016. And I think we know his political leanings, at least in that race. Did he have strong political leanings back then? No.
No, none. No, he just wanted to make money.
Gary Ginsberg, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Andrew.
In the spirit of full journalistic transparency, I think there are too many conflicts here to count, but I absolutely love the documentary and congratulations on it finally being out there. And I think you're the person probably most responsible for making it happen. So it's a true feat.
Well, that's generous of you to say, but there were many other people who were instrumental, without whom that never would have appeared. So, and John Adler, Ever Wonder Studios, Ian Orifice, Rebecca Gitlitz. I mean, so many others. So I don't want to take all the credit.
A team effort.
Indeed.
So tell me about the obviously the genesis of the idea back when you first pitched it and were first thinking about it was your relationship with JFK Jr., which was born out of your time at Brown. Can you tell me about, I think in the documentary you speak about when you got into Brown and you were a paper boy or you were cutting lawns, I forget what it was. Paper boy, everyone would tell you, oh, that's where JFK Jr. goes. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, well, that came up because there was a question about, his name, John. And what was interesting back in 1979 is people only knew him as John. And I made the point that even in 79, when he was just going to college for his freshman year, he was already not only a national figure, but a world figure who was known to every single person on a middle-class block in suburban Buffalo by my paperboy clients. And so it was really to accentuate the point of kind of the universality of his name and fame, even as a kind of, college freshman. And I think the fact that it was such news was he was the first Kennedy not to go to Harvard. I didn't add that to the documentary, but that gave it a special emphasis for people that he had kind of broken that Harvard mold, that all of his cousins, uncles, aunts, grandparents, great-grandparents had hewed to for more than a century.
That's interesting. Did the press follow him to Brown? Did they photograph him while he was there, or that was mainly after?
I was a year behind him, so I wasn't there when he arrived at Brown. I think I don't know the circumstances of his arrival. I suspect the press did come, but when I was there, the press wasn't there at all. He was never followed by paparazzi. They largely just stayed off campus. And even when he was in Providence, they were really not present. They really left him alone.
And you mentioned his name and the John, and obviously he's named after his father. One of the parts of the doc that was most interesting to me was that tension between wanting to be his own person, but also honoring his father by, JFK was a journalist for a brief period of time at the beginning of his career. And it seems like part of the reason why he was excited about George was because he was following in his dad's footsteps somewhat.
Little bit. Yeah. I think I said in the documentary that, he held journalists to a somewhat exalted position, I think is the phrase I used. And I think that's true. I think he was very aware of his father's professional history and knew that the first job he took really after the Navy and in his first job post-college was as a journalist for Hearst covering the opening of the United Nations in San Francisco. And that wasn't lost on him when he was really thinking now for the first time about a career independent of what was expected of him, in terms of going to law school and then being a DA, which really didn't suit his interest, nor necessarily his skills. And now for the first time, he was able to think more creatively. And whether it was a direct outgrowth of what his father chose or not, I can't be certain, but it's certainly, I think, influenced him.
And did he also use it as a discovery tool of sorts to find out more about his father? He had very few memories, if any, of his dad?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and we talk about that a lot in the second episode of the series, which airs Saturday, August 16th, I guess it is. Um, where I'm pretty certain, based on a lot of conversations and actual interviews that he did, that he was using George in part to get a first-person understanding of his father's administration. He had the chance a generation later to go back in history and interview the personalities who directly interfaced with his dad or directly affected his father's administration, whether it was George Wallace, the governor, ex-former governor of Alabama, who, standing in the doorway of the University of Alabama and defying a court order, led his father to go on national TV in June of 1963 and declare for the first time that he was going to pursue a civil rights act, which became the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Or it was going to Cuba to talk to Fidel Castro, who many believe had a hand in the assassination of his father. So I think John had a real curiosity about his father's administration. He only knew it through aides to his father sitting down with him as a young person and telling him about his father's presidency. One of his father's closest aides, Dave Powers, John told me, used to play records of his father's speeches to him on the floor of his apartment on Fifth Avenue. And that was some of his first memories of really hearing his father's voice and understanding what his father was trying to accomplish in his presidency. And so for George, he had access to everybody in the world. He went to Vietnam and interviewed, I think it was General Giap. He took full opportunity to use this platform to do his own exploration of his father's 1,000 days.
And the Castro interview never made it into the pages of George, right?
It did not.
Why was that?
He was really frustrated with the interview, and he was down there for days. Castro jerked him around. He finally sits down with him. It's like an 8-hour dinner. It's recounted in the second episode, and he got back. The news bite that came from it is that he basically said, "I was not involved in your dad's assassination."
Right.
But John, I wasn't I wasn't at the magazine then, so I didn't have full transparency of the deliberations. But I think he was just frustrated with Castro, kind of disgusted by the whole process, and decided to kill it.
And when John begins thinking about George, Jackie is alive at that point, right? And she sets him up with a few critical meetings. Can you talk about how she set him up in New York City and tried to get this idea off the ground?
Yeah, one person in particular that she wanted John to meet was a guy named Joe Armstrong, a really celebrated magazine editor in New York, career that spanned decades. And Joe was really helpful to John in taking him through kind of the nuances of what it would be like to put together a magazine from scratch, and then what it would be like to edit a magazine. Another person that she made available was the legendary editor, Clay Felker, who also sat down with John and gave him a good sense of what the aesthetic of a good magazine involved and entailed. So, yeah, I mean, people said that he was liberated by Jackie's death. I think he was really depressed by her passing. He was an orphan at a pretty young age. His mom was only 64 when she died.
Yeah, that was in the doc. I didn't realize she was that young.
Yeah. And he was very close with her, as was his sister. So that was a big blow.
And was the idea from the beginning that John would be the editor-in-chief, or was there ever discussion of someone else being the editor-in-chief?
No, John was always going to be the editor-in-chief. He appointed an editor, a pretty seasoned editor, who lasted something short of a year. Pretty strong editor who came from the New York Observer, but they didn't really see eye to eye in terms of story ideas and what was appropriate for George, what wasn't. I think Eric, who was the editor, had a different kind of conception of the perfect story for George from John. And so John, within a year, made a really difficult decision to change out editors. And then he then found an editor from the staff, a woman named Biz Mitchell, who served really well for the next 3 years. But John was always going to be the senior most editor of the magazine.
Can you talk about how radical an idea it felt at the time? I mean, today obviously you have entertainment as politics, but
Yeah.
there wasn't a news outlet serving that sort of audience who would be interested in the clash between culture and politics.
No, to the contrary. I mean, if you went to a magazine store, and there were a lot of magazine stores in the 80s and 90s in New York, and you went to the section in politics, you would see a pretty dreary lineup of political magazines. They were all in black and white. They all came from an ideological perspective, either from the left or from the right. And I guess personified by the New Republic on the left and National Review on the right. And the average readership was 98% male, and all came from either New York, Washington, Boston, Los Angeles, Chicago. That would be it. And John looked at that and said, well, this is crazy. Like, this is not appealing to any kind of critical mass of Americans. And politics is far too important to be this inaccessible to the vast majority of Americans. I want to blow up, disrupt this industry, and I want to do a political magazine that will be the exact opposite of what's available now. I want to do it in 4-color, not just black and white, but 4 colors. No magazine in politics had ever been in 4 colors. I want to appeal to women. I want it to be majority read by women. I want the middle of the country to read it. And instead of taking politics so seriously, as all of them did, by focusing entirely on policy and process, I want to focus instead on people and personality and the convergence of politics and culture, by making politics so much more accessible, by seeing the intersections with music and film and sports and fashion. Everything that we take for granted today, he thought this was all original thinking in 1992, 1993. And I want to make it post-partisan. I don't want to come at it from any particular point of view. I think that politics at its best is when people think about it from a post-partisan, not nonpartisan, but post-partisan, where you're thinking and asking what's best for the country, as opposed to what's best for my particular ideology or my particular point of view. And so he wrote it from a really post-partisan perspective. But unfortunately, at a time when it came out in 95, America had moved very sharply to a quite fractured political environment. When he first envisioned this in 92, it was in the glow of the Clinton campaign, when Clinton, to John, was a post-partisan candidate and ultimately a post-partisan president in those first 2 years. But by 94, with Whitewater raging and Newt Gingrich and his contract with America, by the time we launched in September of 95, the country was as divided as ever. So the idea of a post-partisan magazine, even by the launch, felt a little Pollyannish to a lot of people.
The magazine was funded by David Pecker, who ultimately is a character later on in politics when he catches and kills stories for Donald Trump in 2016. And I think we know his political leanings, at least in that race. Did he have strong political leanings back then? No.
No, none. No, he just wanted to make money.
And pretty soon into it, how did, he funded the magazine. How did he feel once things got up and running?
He loved it. I mean, just to be clear, it was the largest magazine launch in history, publishing history. We thought we would sell, 70, 80 pages of ads. We sold 172 pages of ads. We launched with a readership of our first issue of 1.2 million people. I mean, I think the New Republic on a good week would sell 50,000 issues. And that was the largest magazine on the left. So this shattered any any record for a political magazine by, you know, multiple factors. So he was thrilled, and we kept that momentum for a couple of issues. But continuing to do a 4-color magazine with that many pages of content to fill, because if you have 172 ad pages, you got to have a lot of content, or else people are just reading a magazine of ads. So to create that much content required a lot of investment spend. And Hachette was not Condé Nast. They were not deep pocketed. They didn't run a lot of first class, classy.
They weren't the empire of the elite, as
No,
Michael Grimbaum's title
yes,
suggests.
that's exactly right. So Pecker, at a certain point, I think, decided to drain us of some of the resources that we needed to put out a first-rate magazine. John was selling a lot of ad pages, not just for George, but he would go to Detroit and do these massive presentations in front of thousands of ad buyers. And then Hachette would allocate that money that John raised across their stable of magazines. So George wasn't getting even the lion's share of those ad dollars. It was going to Elle, it was going to Car and Driver, or Auto, whatever those magazines were back in the 90s that was under the Hachette brand. And we never felt like George was getting the money that we were due based on John's ability to sell ad pages unlike anybody else in the industry. And I think that created a real crunch for us that made it harder to put out a good product.
I'm not sure this was in the documentary, or at least I don't remember it, but did George cover Donald Trump at all?
No.
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 And
John
talk to
knew
me.
him. John knew him. John used to sit next to him at Knicks games. Their seats were next to each other. And I remember, Trump would often say to John, hey, let's go out after the game. John, as far as I know, never took him up on any of those offers, but they knew each other.
It's interesting. It's funny looking back.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about Carolyn Bessette's role in George? She had, an unofficial role, but an important one.
Yeah, she had a really good aesthetic sense, really good eye for what popped off a page. She worked for Calvin Klein and had a sense of style. And so when she became engaged, and then as John's wife, she played a pretty active role, especially in the art department, especially on the covers, what the look and feel of that cover would be, what the look and feel of of every aspect of the magazine, really. And so she was spending a lot of time looking at the boards as we were putting up stories and their physical layout and the graphics that went with it. And, she had a very strong point of view, as many people said in the documentary. And for some people whose job it was to decide on that look and feel, it could have felt a little intrusive. Others loved it. It really depended on the individual, but she played a very important role.
What's made really clear in the doc is just how much the press hounded them and followed them. Did they ever have personal security?
Never.
I know that they lived in Tribeca in a building without a doorman, right?
Yeah, it's kind of unheard of today to think that a couple of that celebrity wattage would have no security. But in the 90s, it's different. People didn't drive around in bulletproof cars with security, even moguls. I mean, Rupert Murdoch used to take the subway to work, didn't have any security.
Really?
No,
in the 90s?
Yeah, you could walk off the street, walk up to the third floor with no security at before 9/11, you didn't have to check in at a
Right.
desk in the lobby. You just walked up to the floor you needed to go in. And I remember thinking, God, I could just walk right into Rupert Murdoch's office with one 70-year-old assistant between me and the outside door, really. And yeah, it was very common for the most prominent people in New York to go unprotected.
In the documentary, you and others talk about the chances that John had to run for office or even be appointed to a seat. I think there's talk of a congressional seat, maybe on the Upper West Side. Um, did he want to run for office one day? Was that something you and him talked about?
Yeah, I think he ultimately did see himself in public life. But as I say in the documentary, he first thought he needed to prove to himself and then to the world that he deserved it. Um, the story you just alluded to happened in 1992 when Ted Weiss, who was a congressman on the Upper West Side, died suddenly of a heart attack in September of 92, 2 months before the election. And John's uncle, Teddy Kennedy, called him and said, I can get you the seat right now. Do you want it? They'll give you the seat. John was a constituent living then in the district. And John said, no, I got to earn it. And when he left the DA, I think part of his challenge was to find something and then do something that could convince himself, and then, as I say, others, that he had the mettle to be in public life. And I think starting a business that created jobs, that created buzz, that created a product that people enjoyed, that came from his brain and through his energies, would satisfy that standard that John had set for himself. And I think at the end of his life, he felt like he had accomplished that goal and was now ready for something else.
And do you think he could have run for governor?
Yeah, I mean, he clearly wanted to. He was looking at running for the Senate in the spring of '99. Pat Moynihan had unexpectedly decided to step down as the senior senator in New York, and it was going to be an open primary. And John immediately started talking to me and many others about the possibility of him throwing his hat in the ring. And he had a series of meetings, one of which is described in the documentary, with the head of the largest labor union in New York. And he went to this leader, and the leader said, 100%, I will put my entire membership behind you if you want to run. I had him talk to a very famous Republican political guru who gave him similar advice that, yeah, John, if you want to run, you would be a very, very formidable candidate. The problem is Hillary Clinton was eyeing it at the very same time. And she got to the chair of the Democratic State Committee, a woman named Judith Hope. And Judith Hope, I think it was in April of '99, did a press conference with Hillary where she effectively anointed her as the nominee of the party without any kind of primary. And the primary wasn't going to be for another year. And so John decided not to take on the First Lady of the United States. It just didn't appeal to him that his first run would be against somebody that formidable.
And in 2002, there was I think, a governor's race in New York. His family member, Andrew Cuomo, ran in that primary. How would that have sorted itself out? That would one of them have had to decide, I'm running or you're running?
Well, like, a lot had to go right. I mean, I talked to John about this literally the last full night of his life on July 15th. We were just sitting at a Yankees game and we had a lot of time to kill. And we were musing about that as being the really smart race to run. Because I think John thought of himself more as an executive than as a legislator. And he looked at his father's career and realized that his father kind of chafed at some of the legislative demands of the House and the Senate. And John said that, that he was largely bored having to sit through the tedium of House hearings and Senate hearings, which could go on, infinitum. And I think John thought of himself as more of an executive because I think he had proven to himself that he had really good leadership qualities and could inspire people and so forth.
You mentioned you spent the last full night of his life with him. I believe you were with the Murdoch children that night, right, at a Yankees game?
Yeah.
And you were there because George was doing okay and he was looking to exit it. Is that right?
It wasn't doing okay. I think John that day had basically been told Hachette was done funding it. John said he went to see Pecker had left, and there was a new head of Hachette, and he went up to see the new head that afternoon. And John put his bottle of water on the desk. He was sitting across the desk from the CEO. And the CEO was so nervous about the meeting that he picked up John's water bottle and started drinking from it. And that was John's tell that it was going to be a bad meeting. And I think at that meeting, he was told that Hachette was going to no longer fund it. So John had a choice of trying to find new funding or do something entirely new. And I think he was looking at both paths. And that's why we were at the Yankees game that night, is because I had talked to Lachlan and James about.
Were you at News Corp at this
I was
point?
already at News Corp.
Okay.
Yeah. And we had two magazines. We were a big publishing company, obviously, with newspapers and a book company, but we also had a couple of magazines. And I mentioned to them that George might be on the block, and I think they were willing to kick the tires on it. So they talked with John, in the break during innings, but it was pretty clear to me that it wasn't going to go anywhere. It was clear to John too, that, I think they were willing to entertain it at the time, but I didn't think it would necessarily go anywhere. So we spent a good chunk of the time just talking about politics and his career, among other things. And he clearly said, look, I think that the play here is go after Pataki, who was, and then in his third term as governor, and a little long in the tooth. And there was no really formidable Democrat who was looking to run against him at that point. I know, again, it's 3 years ahead of time. He had just been reelected in 98. And as you point out, Andrew, the primary ended up being Carl McCall and Andrew Cuomo. And McCall killed Andrew, and then McCall himself got killed. So, could John have won?
Who knows?
Who knows? Yeah.
I heard you speak about on another podcast your son Alex Briss and how that related to the series of events that would unfold in the next day. Can you talk about? I think John called you to let you know that he would not be making it to the Briss, right?
He would not. Yes, he had a choice of either going to my son's bris, which is a circumcision in the Jewish religion, on the 8th day, or getting his cast off that Thursday morning so that he could fly to the vineyard and then to Hyannis by himself without a flight instructor. And he much preferred to fly by himself. And he had been hurt in May in an accident with a
contraption.
A contraption. Yes, yeah. I tried to get out. I was with him once on the vineyard, and he tried to get me to go up in that contraption. And thank God I couldn't get up there, because there's no way I would have landed it. But he was landing it, and it got caught in a tree, and he broke his ankle. And so he was in a cast for like almost 6 or 7 weeks at that point. And he was really eager to get it off and to get flying alone again. So I said, yeah, I'll see you tomorrow night at the Yankees game. So he got the cast off, and then the next night he flew by himself.
When did he take up flying?
I think it must have been 96, 95, 96. I mean, so I was working with him when he started flying. Can't remember when he first took lessons.
And in the documentary, they talk about how he really felt like that was the only place he could be alone, and he really loved that, being away from the ground. Is that something that he spoke to you about?
He did. Yeah. I said, why are you flying? Like, of all the things, because flying is like, you gotta go down a checklist. You gotta be like really anal, and that, I wasn't like that. But I said, well, so like, why you want to fly? And he said, because it's the only place in the world I can go where I'm left entirely alone. And I love the solitude of being up in that sky where the only person I need to talk to is the air traffic controller. It's a complete respite for me. And, hard to argue with that.
Yeah.
And look, he ended up being a really good pilot. I mean, I flew with him a couple of times. He always had another pilot with him, but I would sit right by him, and he was really serious about it. He took it really seriously. He was very fastidious about, conforming to all the requirements of time in the pit, time with, he fulfilled all of his requirements, took all of his tests. So, it wasn't like he was a bad pilot by any means. I think he just kind of flew into a perfect storm of bad conditions at the wrong moment.
What do you hope audiences take away from this doc?
That for a brief shining moment, there was a guy who was probably going to go on to the political horizon who could have been a really inspiring, unifying figure at a time when politics was coarse, and we were deprived of it at a moment when I think he was ready to enter into it. And it's so, I think there's a beauty to the story because he was such an elegant person who wore his fame with such ease and such gentility. I mean, he was just one of the great people, and everybody who met him had the same reaction to him, that he was incredibly accessible and playful and fun and curious, and was the antithesis of, the kind of celebrity that you would expect today with that kind of wattage, because he, as we talked about earlier, he traveled without any security. He loved to interact with people of every income level, education level, race, color, creed. He was a man of the people. And I think he would have made a really interesting political figure had he lived long enough to enter the arena.
All of that is explored in the documentary, and it's a fantastic piece of work. So, Gary, thank you for making it, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew, for having me.